Hello and welcome to the National Army Museum's very special new exhibition, Brothers in Arms. I'm James Holland and we've put this exhibition together on the back of an earlier book that I wrote of the same title about the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry. Very ordinary men who ended up doing extraordinary things. We're focusing just on the period from D-Day to the end of the war in May 1945, and we really hope that this virtual tour will give you a flavour and a taste of some of the things that we've got on offer and really entice you to come and visit it in person. I hope you enjoy it. Well, I think when we're thinking about the Second World War, it's really about human drama that draws us in more than anything else. That's certainly the case for me. And while I'm massively interested in the kind of the nitty-gritty of it and the whys and the wherefores and how decisions were made and why things turned out the way they did, really it's always about the human drama, the human experience of war and this idea of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And that's certainly the case with the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry, who were a yeomanry regiment before the war. That means they're kind of part-time soldiers, what we would now call territorials. And, they would do their kind of, sort of weekend soldiering, summer camp in August, that sort of thing. And they started the war on horseback. And what that meant was, these are people who had other lives. They had other things to do. And then suddenly the war came a-calling and they were called up on a more permanent basis and they went off to do their thing. And with the book that I wrote, I focused in on a handful of characters, a reasonably large cast list. But when it came to doing this exhibition, we were all very, very keen, all of us that were involved in it, to make sure that this was about the people first and foremost. And although there were hundreds of people who fought and served with the Sherwood Rangers, we decided to home in on just a handful, just 8 people. It was incredibly difficult to choose which 8 we should focus on. But in a way, they kind of sort of, in the end, I think they sort of chose themselves. And this are the 8. And if we start here, we've got Lieutenant Colonel Stanley Christopherson. Well, Stanley Christopherson is an amazing fellow, kept journals all the way through the war, diaries and all the rest of it. And he started off actually being in the city, serving in the city in the 1930s. He'd worked in South Africa, then came back, worked in the city, joined the Sherwood Rangers in 1939, went over to Palestine with the horses in 1940, ended up being a squadron commander, and later took over command of the regiment. Took over the command of the regiment on the 11th of June when regimental headquarters was hit at Saint-Pierre. And he was an amazing guy. He stepped into the breach. He was one of these guys who was always smiling, always had ready for a laugh. He was brilliant about kind of keeping an eye on the guys and making sure that morale was always maintained. He came to command with a really different approach to leadership, one that was very inclusive, that was open-minded to people's suggestions, and he was an absolute inspiration. Everyone in the regiment just completely loved him. So he had to be there, and we've got a lot of his artefacts thanks to his son David, who's a great friend of mine, so there's that personal connection, and his daughter Sarah Jane, and they've both been absolutely brilliant in lending us stuff and bits and pieces, more of which in a moment. Then there's Sergeant George Dring. Well, Dring is just an absolute ledge when it comes to the regiment. He's a pre-war territorial, he was a jockey, he was a countryman, could read the lie of the land really well. Absolutely, completely steadfast, courage could never be doubted, always there in a crisis, one of those sort of backbone of the army types who just really stepped up when it was needed. And he became the #1 tank destroyer, enemy tank destroyer in the regiment, if not in the entire British Army. He had some incredible feats, and one of his favoured tricks was to actually get out of his tank and stalk them first, stalk enemy tanks first, because of course when you're down on the ground you can sort of hustle close to the hedgerows, you can sort of peek where a tank can't peek because it's so big. Then he'd come back to the tank and then take it out, and on the 26th of June 1944 he destroyed 5 enemy tanks, 2 Tigers, 1 Panther, and 2 Panzer Mark IVs. That's quite some feat. If he'd been a fighter pilot, that would be an ace in a day. So he's an amazing guy. Again, much loved within the regiment, much revered to those still serving in the Sherwood Rangers. Then we come to Lieutenant Harry Heenan, and he's a fascinating character because I was lucky enough to get a look at all his letters, his wartime letters, and there's lots and lots of them. And he's a really fascinating man because he's a kind of boy man. You know, he's 21 on the 25th of August 1944, but he's not quite shed his youthful skin, and his letters to his parents, which he writes most days, are sort of full of bravado one minute and then kind of somber reflection the next. And you can see that there is still that kind of youthful teenage spirit in him, and yet he's old enough to command a troop of 4 tanks in the Sherwood Rangers in the middle of a kind of frightening, brutal, terrifying war. And it's amazing reading those letters because his character just really sings off every page. You can see that he's a happy-go-lucky fellow. He's very devout, but you can also see the sense of humour, the sense of joy, the kind of, you know, that he'd be a great friend to people. And really, when you're reading these letters, it's like putting flesh back onto bones of someone who's long since departed. And that's a really profoundly moving exercise. And we've got a couple of his letters here. And, you know, I'm really glad we were able to include him. And sadly, he doesn't make it through as well. So those letters, they're just extra poignant because he actually dies on the 25th of September, 1944, having just saved the life of his best friend in A Squadron, David Render. So saves his best friend 1 minute, and he's dead the next. It's a terrible tragedy, and it means reading those letters makes it all the more poignant. Then we got Trooper Ernie Leopard, and I love Ernie. He's such a character. He's from Clapham in South London, and you can really, you know, in his he gave a number of interviews and wrote down bits and pieces, and whether it's his writing or whether it's him just talking, again, his character really shines through, and it's impossible not to empathise with him. His reactions and responses to the situations in which he finds himself are incredibly human, and all told with that kind of sort of, you know, sort of slightly worldly, slightly happy-go-lucky kind of working class Londoners kind of take on it. And he's just an incredibly likeable character. And I found that when I was reading his accounts and listening to him talking about his experiences, I could really sort of relate to it. I could really empathise. It really felt like you could respond to, you could understand why he was saying and reacting in the way, saying what he was saying and reacting in the way he did. So a really, really attractive guy. Then there's Lieutenant Stan Perry, and Stan I was very lucky to get to know and got to know him very well, and he was a charming fellow, had a twinkle in his eye, and was obviously a very, very good natural leader of men. You know, he went in as a 20-year-old, immediately took command of his troop, and this could be very difficult because, you know, you might be arriving into theatre, and he arrived on the 10th of June, so the day before the headquarters of the regiment was hit and Stanley Christopherson took over. And, you know, you've got guys in your troop who might be in their late 30s and married with kids, and suddenly this whippersnapper comes in and he's expected to kind of be telling them what to do. It's quite a difficult dynamic, but he just nailed it right from the word go. And he was also profoundly moving about his experiences. And sadly, he passed away this year. I spent the weekend with him, the third weekend of September this year, 2021, and then on the 6th of October he passed away, and it's traumatic. It's really sad, you know, that link to that living link to the regiment is really slipping away. I think there's kind of 2 or 3 Sherwood Rangers from the war who are still alive, and that's it. You know, 10 years ago there were lots. Now there's that link that we had here. You know, I was expecting Stan to be here on the opening night, and that's not to be, but a wonderful, wonderful fellow. And then there's Major John Semkin. Well, Semkin is, he's a guy I'm rather in awe of, I've got to say. He was 23 in June 1944 when they arrived in D-Day. He took command of A Squadron, and he was obviously just completely brilliant at it. You know, there's so much responsibility on the shoulders of men like him. And I was lucky enough with David Christopherson, the son of Stanley, my great mate, to go and talk to John back in 2012, and at some length. And it was profoundly moving. I can't even begin to tell you how much so. I think I've done something in the region of about 300 interviews for Second World War veterans. And I would count that as, on one hand, as, you know, one of the top 4 interviews that I've done with war veterans. He was incredibly articulate, incredibly measured about his experiences. He was able to analyse what had happened to him, contextualise it, but it was also very, very clear that he was still deeply traumatised by what had happened to him. So a remarkable fellow and someone with whom I have just so much admiration. Then really, I mean, Reverend Leslie Skinner, I mean, he's one of the great legends of the Sherwood Rangers. He's an absolutely extraordinary guy. He's the chaplain, the padre. You know, he's in charge of pastoral care, I suppose is what we'd call it in modern parlance. And yes, he holds church services, but he's so much more than that. He's there for people to talk to. And people do talk to him. He's very, very approachable. But he also has this ability to look out for people, and he can see when people are kind of, you know, nerves are fraying a little bit and perhaps they need shifting into the echelons, you know, support troops and drive a truck rather than a tank. You know, perhaps they need, as an officer, a stint at regimental headquarters as, I don't know, intelligence officer or something, or perhaps they need to go on a course just to give them a little bit of a break. He's very good at kind of looking out for those guys. But also what he does is he takes it as his personal responsibility to make sure that he personally buries every single member of the Sherwood Rangers that gets killed. He doesn't want the men to have to do it. He doesn't feel that that's part of their job. Their job is to be in tanks and do it. They shouldn't be reminded about the ghastliness of how they might die. And so he does that himself, and his diaries are littered with times where he's throwing up because of the kind of ghastliness of what he's got to do. I mean, he's really an amazing, amazing guy, really humane, wonderful human being, and of course he had to be in it. And then finally we've got Captain Bill Wharton, and I'd edited Stanley's diaries and journals some years ago, and in the aftermath of that, Michael Wharton, Bill's son, got in touch with me and sent me transcripts of all his father's wartime letters. And again, a bit like the Harry Heenan letters, the character just comes across so strongly, and I think of all the characters that I came across, I'm especially fond of Bill Wharton. I just really feel like I know his 31-year-old self, and an incredibly likeable figure he is too. He's married, has barely seen his wife in 5 years, and it's just a reminder of what a sort of a lovely, gentle, good person who loves his wife, loves his family, loves his home, but has gone that extra yard and is serving his country for 5 long years. And he's an example of that ordinary person stepping up and doing extraordinary things. And so we've got some of his letters here. And again, it's been a privilege to kind of get to know this person who's been dead a number of years now, but has sort of come back to life through reading his letters. And just in this first section, we've got a couple of artifacts which really relates to some of the key characters. So first of all, this is the 9 of Hearts. And this belonged to Stanley Christopherson. And Stanley didn't like people wishing him good luck. He kind of thought it was bad luck to be wished good luck. But just when he was in the kind of in the camp before boarding up on the landing craft to go over to D-Day, he was wandering around and he saw this 9 of Hearts on the ground, and he picked it up and he thought, that's going to be my lucky mascot. And he put it in his breast pocket and he kept it there throughout the rest of the war. And there it is. That's the one. And it's hard to kind of relate just what that means. I mean, it's an incredible thing to see that card which has traveled so many miles, and if only it could see what things it had seen. And there it is on the cabinet and part of this exhibition. And then here we've got a letter from Bill Wharton in his beautiful handwriting, written to his wife on the eve of D-Day, the 1st of June. And it's amazing because his wife's birthday is on the 5th and the wedding anniversary is the 6th of June. And of course, 6th of June is what becomes D-Day. So important dates for him before the invasion. But, you know, I might just read out a little extract here. It's just so kind of evocative of the place and time. And he's at his camp and he's got his tent and he's sitting outside his tent and he says, "As I look up now at the green leaves on the trees swaying in the breeze, I have a sudden pang of longing to be walking there with you. Old memories come to me of you and I crossing the golf links to old Joe Cam's land and through to the road that led back to the schoolhouse. It is hard to realise that it is 5 years since we did those things, and harder still to think that we have to wait through more months before we will be together again." I mean, incredible. I mean, how can you not be moved by that? And that's just the tip of the iceberg. One of the things about an exhibition is inevitably you're showing some very, very precious artifacts, and of course they have to be behind a glass case. but some things that I was really, really keen that people were able to touch and feel, that kind of tactile link to the past. And that's why we've got a couple of uniforms on show, one of which is the oversuit, which is always known as the pixie suit by the men. And that's because when you put the hood up, it's got a sort of pointed hood at the back, which makes you look a little bit like a pixie. And anyway, the name stuck. This would have been worn, this was issued in October 1944 to the guys, and it would have been worn over their battle dress. So you had battle dress trousers, battle blouse, which is the jacket with your belt and all the rest of it, and you'd literally just put this on over the top. It's incredibly generously cut, and it's quite modern for the time. I mean, if you think about what soldiers looked like just 5 years earlier, completely different, and suddenly you're moving into an age of zips and poppers, and you can see that it's got all sorts of amazing pockets. It's got pockets there, pockets here, stuff for putting pens in, more pockets here, another pocket on the leg and two on the leg. I mean, it's absolutely incredible, really. And this very fine serge line, so it's very warm. And the other thing about serge, about wool is incredibly fireproof, certainly compared to cotton. So cotton on the outside and serge on the inside, warm, surprisingly comfortable, and with lots of bits to it. So it's a really, really nice design, and you can see it's got this elasticated inner bit on the cuff, so that stops water going down if it's raining. And you can see all this staining on here. And this is the remnants of the, and you can feel it's slightly scrunchy, and that's the remnants of the waterproofing treatment that they used to put on it. And it's just stained it a little bit. But I really want people, when they come here, to be able to touch it, feel it, press the poppers, take them off again, you know, and get a sense of what it was like wearing some of these uniforms. Well, this is the second of our uniforms that I wanted people to be able to touch, and this is the battle dress. It's a battle blouse, and although there was a kind of sort of battle dress all-in-one kind of sort of boiler suit effectively, most of the Sherwood Rangers ended up wearing these. This is what they went over to France in for D-Day, and it's what they wore most of the summer and most of the time through to 1945, with the pixie suits over the top. So this is a standard jacket, and as you can see, it's very, very short. But, you know, in a way it's very, very practical, because back in the day, you'd have had much higher trousers that would come right up to your navel. And so the British point of view is, what's the point of having a jacket that comes down to here, where the flaps just sort of get in the way, particularly if you're kind of jumping in and out of vehicles and tanks. And also, you might as well save yourself a foot's worth of wool by having a shorter jacket. So this actually sort of clips in. You can just see on the back of here, these buttonholes here. So this can clip onto the back of your trousers to sort of join the whole thing as one. So very practical. And of course, the one thing that the British have is lots of sheep, lots of wool, access to lots of wool. So wool, again, is kind of, you know, basically quite fireproof. It's very warm. Of course, it gets very soggy if it gets wet, but it does dry reasonably quickly. They're not brilliantly made, but they're robust and hardy. And what I like about this one is you can see it's really worn down. They're much kind of sort of rougher when you first get them. And what a lot of guys did was, when they got their battle dresses, they would sort of rub them down with their brushes, their shoe brushes, to try and get off that top layer of wool, to just sort of smooth it down a little bit so it was a little bit more comfortable. This one has been done up as John Semken's battle dress. It's not actually John Semken's battle dress. It really is a battle dress from the Second World War. It was issued, and you can see here, you can see the yellow pips. That's a Major pips for Major John Semken. In the Royal Armoured Corps, the RAC, they would have yellow officers' pips rather than khaki ones like the Army. And you can see there's the Sherwood Rangers, so that's a regimental badge. And here is the russet fox's head on a yellow circle of the 8th Armoured Brigade, to which the Sherwood Rangers were attached. And here are his medals, the campaign medals, and then the military cross. And again, I'm very keen that people do have a chance to kind of feel it, and you can see the lining of it, and, you know, open the buttons and put them back again, and just you get a feeling of what it was like. Some years ago, I was making a TV show, and we had to do 15 miles in full battle dress with as infantrymen, actually, rather than tankmen, but with all the webbing, you know, the canvas belts and pouches and all the rest of it on. And I was kind of dreading it. I thought it was going to be sort of horribly itchy and really uncomfortable. And I was amazed by how comfortable it was. Everything just fitted together beautifully. It was incredibly comfortable to walk in and move in. And I had absolutely no complaints at all. The only complaints were on my feet. didn't fancy those hobnail boots one bit, and my toes were absolutely shredded at the end of it. But by and large, I think boots aside, I think the uniforms that they were given were pretty good. A lot of the guys in the Sherwood Rangers ditched the boots, these hobnail boots. They're not ideal for clambering around on tanks because, of course, you have metal on the leather soles, and that can sort of slip and slide on other metal surfaces. So they replaced them with rubber boots. They might sort of captured rubber boots, or boots they purloined from Americans, their allies, or they might just be shoes, desert suede shoes that they've, crepe-soled shoes and suede leather shoes that they've got from when they were in North Africa. So a real mixture, and no one really minded too much. There was a pretty loose approach to uniforms, and you can see that when you look at some of the photographs. And indeed, when you look at the footage of Stanley Christopherson on his Tiger tank, you can see that he's wearing a very, very natty cream woolen sweater underneath his battle dress. I suppose one of the really big takeaways for me from doing the Brothers in Arms project, both the book and this exhibition, is just the awesome amount of responsibility on the shoulders of the officers, whether they be troop commanders with 4 tanks under their command, whether they be a squadron commander, or whether it be a regimental headquarters where obviously Stanley Christopherson is the commanding officer. These are such young guys, and so much responsibility is put on their shoulders. And in this sequence, we've decided to focus on John Semken, who is the A Squadron commander, aged 23 years old. So pretty darn young. And when I think about what I was like at 23, what a feckless, useless individual I was. So it's hard to kind of put yourself into his shoes and think about what he had to confront. First of all, there's the matter of communications. So in a tank, it's too noisy to have anything other than an intercom on. So you have to have headset on, and you communicate through a throat microphone. Then you've got to have B-net, and the B-net is what enables John Semken to communicate with the rest of the regiment, and that's on one frequency. And then you switch to your number 19 radio set, and we've got an example of the number 19 just over there, and that's onto the A-net, and that enables Semken to listen and communicate with regimental headquarters, and also occasionally infantry or the Essex Yeomanry, the artillery, for example. So that means that John's got to listen to his own tank crew on the tank intercom. He's got to listen to and communicate with the rest of the squadron on the B-net, and the wider regimental net, the A-net, all at the same time. And while he's doing that, he's got his head and shoulders out of the turret, because yes, there are periscopes inside, but the moment you go inside, you can't really see very much. The periscopes are kind of like that, and they're kind of next to useless. So you've got to have your head and shoulders above the turret. And of course, the human body is incredibly vulnerable, and at the top of a very high tank already, you're even more vulnerable. And lots of people were getting sniped throughout the war on the top of their turret and their tank. So it's an incredibly dangerous position to be. Whilst at the same time, you've just got to watch all the time. And you've got to make snap decisions. No faffing around. You've just got to make snap decisions upon which the lives and deaths of your crews, your squadron, might depend. So there's a huge amount to think about. And you've got to deal with the infantry. And constantly get out of your turret, clamber down, go and talk to the infantry commander whom you're supporting. So there's an awful lot to think about. And then you add that onto your average daily day. So this is the 26th of June that we've chosen, which was a big day for A Squadron. But John Semken wasn't getting to bed to sleep the night before until about midnight, because the last thing he had to do before turning in was have an O group, an orders group, where you're getting the kind of briefing for the following day. Then finally he gets his head down, and that's not in nice crisp cotton sheets or anything. That is on the ground, on the hard earth, the tarpaulin over you, something like that. Then you're woken at 3 o'clock, 3:30, cup of tea, get moving. The wireless operators tuning in and netting in to the radio frequencies. Might finally sort of get moving about 4 o'clock, 6 o'clock, something like that. And then I don't know, you might be in combat for, say, 6 hours of standing up in the turret, getting in and out, watching, making snap decisions, mentally and physically utterly exhausting. On the 26th of June, John Semken was in action from 5:20 till about 10 o'clock at night, finally pulled back. You don't want to be right up in the front line overnight. You want to be pulled back where you can be safe, where you can, because you can't see anything at night time. Then the crew have to kind of replenish the tank with ammunition, with fuel, get something to eat, then it's the O group, and so it starts all over again. You know, if you get 3 to 4 hours sleep in a 24-hour period, you're doing incredibly well. So you can just imagine the physical and mental demands of that, doing that day after day, and you might be expected to do that for 6, 7, 8 days on the trot, are just absolutely enormous, whilst at the same time you have the life and death of your men in your hands to a certain extent. I just don't know how they did it. I'm completely in awe of what they went through. I think there is this kind of ongoing perception that somehow the Allied armies in Northwest Europe got off lightly compared to, say, those on the Eastern Front. And you know, when you think about the slaughter of the Second World War, particularly in the European War, it's really on the Eastern Front that we think about the kind of the biggest bloodletting, and of course that's absolutely the case. But the way the Allied armies worked was that they had a very, very sharp tip of the spear and a very, very long shaft. And so the support troops were enormous, but actually those who were kind of in the firing line were really directly in the firing line were comparatively few. And it's very interesting, you know, Sherwood Rangers were part of the 8th Armoured Brigade, which was part of the British Second Army. And actually, if you break up the British Army, the British Second Army, what you find is that only 14% were in the infantry, only 8% were in tanks, and 18% were engineers, 22% artillery, 43% service corps. So what that suggests is you've got this incredibly strong support system behind you, which was absolutely the case. And it was a very sensible way of doing things. But if you were unfortunate enough to be in the infantry or in armoured units, your chances of survival were statistically absolutely zero. And I have to admit, when I kind of discovered this, I was quite shocked by that. The other thing to understand is that in an armoured regiment, such as the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry, you have 688 men all told. But only 327 of those are actually in tanks. The rest are in the echelons, A echelon, B echelon, which are the support troops, helping those in the tanks to kind of, you know, keep supplied with food and ammunition and all the other things that they need. So of that 8% in the British Army that are in tanks, only about 40% or so are actually in tanks. So it's a comparatively small number, about 3% of British Army, 3.5% of the British Army all told. And the casualty figures were absolutely appalling. So in the Sherwood Rangers, they had a 142% casualty rate over the entire period as a proportion of their full contingency. And that's a lot. And the guys would kind of learn very, very quickly, particularly kind of new guys coming out, that the chances of getting through unscathed were really, really small, with diminishing returns the longer they survived. And I think this was a really, really, really tough burden to bear. And of course, there were people who got through unscathed, but they were the exception, not the norm. And there wasn't a single tank that served with the Sherwood Rangers between the 6th of June 1944 and the 4th of May 1945 that wasn't hit at some point. It was going to happen. And whether you were badly wounded, lightly wounded, had your legs blown off, or were incinerated to a crisp was really just a matter of chance. One of the letters that absolutely, I just set the hairs on the back of my neck on end, was this one by Stuart Hills. And Stuart Hills was one of the very, very lucky ones who did actually make it through. Now, his parents were actually prisoners of the Japanese. They lived in the Far East. He'd been sent over to England to boarding school during the 1930s and early part of the war. And his best friend there was a chap called Dennis Elmore. And Dennis was a school scholar. He was also a brilliant sportsman. And Stuart and Dennis both opened the batting for Tunbridge School at Lord's, the home of cricket, back in the summer of 1942. They were super tight, went to Sandhurst together, went to Bovington together, joined the Sherwood Rangers together, although they were actually in separate squadrons. And the latter part of the war, Dennis had been the intelligence officer, but begged to be allowed to be put back into one of the Sabre squadrons. And so he was. And on the 19th of April, so just a couple of weeks before the end of the Second World War for the Sherwood Rangers, he was operating on the southwest outskirts of Bremen. They were closing in on the city. And he turned out of a crossroads, went up a road, disappeared from view. There was a massive loud bang, and he'd been hit by an 88mm anti-tank gun. The whole crew were killed instantly. And when Stuart Hills learned this, he was just absolutely overcome with grief. And I remember reading this letter when I was first researching all this stuff. And even reading it now, it's still just, it's so raw with grief. And so he writes this letter on the 22nd of April, leaving it a few days to Dennis's mother, because he wants to make sure that by the time he receives the letter that she's already learned the terrible news. And he says, Dennis was killed on the evening of the 19th of April on the southwestern outskirts of Bremen. His tank was hit and he was killed instantly. There is very little else I can say, except to send my very deepest sympathy. And then this is a bit that really, really gets me every time. I loved him better than anyone else in the world, so I know just how you feel, and the bottom has been knocked out of my world. And I think it's one of the things that really makes the Sherwood Rangers stand out is just what a decent bunch of people they were. They weren't all saints by any stretch of the imagination, but they were fundamentally good people, ordinary people, expected to do extraordinary things, stand up, put their lives on the line, and they absolutely did that. But it doesn't matter how hardened you come to death and the brutality of war, when you lose your best mate or someone really, really close to you, that hurts very, very deeply indeed. Well, more people were wounded than were killed, I'm glad to say. And one of those was Stan Perry. In fact, he was wounded twice. He was first shot in the arm by a sniper at Burjou in August 1944. And then he returned. But before he returned, he'd recovered and he was sort of doing quite well by about September 1944. And then he met his future wife, who was actually Danish, Anneliese. And they had a bit of a whirlwind romance, and what of it being war and everything. He then proposed and she accepted. And they got married in December 1944. Whirlwind wedding. And then next thing he knew, he was back out to rejoin the Sherwood Rangers at the personal request of Stanley Christopherson, who needed experienced, decent officers like Stan. And the first action he was involved with was Operation Blackcock, which was an attack on Heinsberg, right on the German border, part of the Siegfried Line, or the West Wall as it was also called. Snow was on the ground, freezing temperatures. It was a horrible time and horrible conditions in which to fight. And he was wounded on the 21st of January 1945, the same day as Bill Wharton, incidentally, was also wounded. His war was over at that point. But on the second one, Stan was wounded pretty badly. And actually his life was saved because of his wife. Because before he'd left, his wife had given him this leather wallet with a kind of twin pictures of her in it. And here it is here. And a piece of shrapnel, a mortar shrapnel, had pierced it, gone through it, and he'd had it in his breast pocket. So it went through the battle, through his pixie suit, through the battle dress, through the leather wallet, both sides, into his skin. And the piece of shrapnel, when they operated on him, was resting against the very edge of his heart. Can you imagine that? You don't get a closer shave than that one. But even so, he was hit in the arm as well, elsewhere on the chest and on the face, and he was in a really, really bad way. And you can imagine what Anneliese was thinking, because suddenly she's getting this telegram saying, your husband regret to inform you, your husband has been very badly wounded on the 22nd of January. Then just a few days later, on the 27th, she gets a letter from the War Office, which says, I regret to have to inform you that a report has been received by telegraph from the military authorities in Western Europe that your husband, Lieutenant S.A. Perry, Royal Army Corps, was wounded and placed on the seriously ill list on the 22nd of January 1945. But then, to make matters worse, just a few days later, she gets a telegram and it says, further report received from Western Europe that Lieutenant S.A. Perry, Royal Army Corps, has transferred from the seriously ill list to the dangerously ill list on the 1st of February 1945. Now you can imagine what she must have felt like. Now of course, they're having to process thousands of casualties all the time, and telegrams are necessarily curt, but just imagine what you would be feeling if you're Anneliese getting that. You must be wondering whether yours is going to be one of the shortest marriages ever. As it turns out, Stan lived to a ripe old age, as did Anneliese. They had 3 kids. He had a very, very good life, so did she. And he actually only recently passed away on the 6th of October 2021, aged 97. And I guess if you told him that's how long he was going to live on the 1st of February 1945, when he was lying there prostrate in an American field hospital, I reckon he'd have taken that. Well, one of my favourite artefacts in the entire exhibition is this one here. At first glance, it just looks like a little piece of paper, but this is the message book on which the last message of the war was taken down and handed over to Stanley Christopherson in the farmyard at Karlshofen, in that kind of sort of amazing hinterland between Bremen and Hamburg. It's largely kind of sort of rural, agricultural, rather flat ground. And the farmhouse they were in was a beautiful place, lovely kind of brick and old tiled buildings, lovely oak trees nearby. And it was sort of early summer evening. And they were expecting to have to attack Bremenhaven. And suddenly this message came. And as you can see, it's right at the very bottom that it's written down, and it's written on an already used piece. And Stanley was initially a little bit irritated about this because he wanted to be able to read it properly and couldn't understand why the guy who'd taken the message had written it so hurriedly on a kind of sort of rough piece of paper. And then he read the words. And it says, "No advance beyond present position, no further harassing fire, no practical move without further orders. BBC News confirmed. German army in front, surrenders at 0800. Details of procedure will follow." I mean, can you imagine? It's all over. That is the end of the war. And Stanley said that had a mixture of emotions. The first one was one of extreme exhilaration that they'd all made it, that he had survived, that he would live to see the rest of his life. And then there was one of deep regret for all those friends that weren't with him to share this incredible moment. And I have to say, October 2020, I was standing there in pretty much the same spot with David Christopherson, Stanley's son. It was a beautiful October evening. Trees were still in leaf, and you could half close your eyes and you could sort of almost smell the pipe smoke and the cigarette smoke and hear the clangs of mechanics on German tanks and visualize the jeeps and trucks and Shermans and the hubbub of regimental headquarters in this tiny little corner of northern Germany. And imagine Stanley receiving it, and there it is, that piece of paper that for him ended the war, and for all of those in the Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry.